final presentation deals with the end of the negotiation details. If the parties have been successful in closing the deal and reaching a settlement, they should make sure that they go back and review their initial agenda or issue list and that everything is covered, or to the extent there may be some minor loose ends, that there's a plan for those loose ends. And make sure no one leaves the room without getting a draft of the agreement in writing, either some sort of memorandum of understanding or an actual draft of the agreement, particularly if there are key terms that it took a long time to resolve. Also, going back to the initial preparation, one of the reasons it was important to have people with authority in the room and available to participate is so you avoid the ability of someone to say, 3 more people need to review this, and in that process those people start picking apart the details without the advantage of having been in the room and understanding how those details were reached. So it's important to have those decision makers, as many of them as possible, there. Always establish a review timeline. You may want to have some flexibility in the initial dates to account for people's other business. But you may want to build in there, if it's any sort of extended timeline or the parties have any sense that something might fall apart in the review process, build in a mandatory meeting. It's often harder to say, I'm rethinking this, if you have to tell the person that you just spent 8 hours or several days in a room with hammering it out. So think about the things that could go wrong in that timeline and find some ways to work around them. And again, do this while you're still in the room after reaching the agreement, so it's mutual. Also, is there anyone else who's going to be impacted by this settlement? The parties should, again, jointly discuss a communication plan. Who needs to know what, when? Is the press involved? Who is going to make that call? Are the parties issuing separate press releases? If so, are you going to compare them so they are substantially similar and the press releases don't cause a new dispute? Also, and this doesn't matter if it's a public communication or just public within one's organization, if one party made a significant concession, it's important to acknowledge that and talk with the other side about how they want it acknowledged. There are some situations where they may just appreciate that you asked that question, but that again goes to trust and ongoing relationship building in future negotiations, as does thanking each other. If it's a particularly good resolution, you may want to do a bit of joint debriefing. Sometimes that's held off until later, although usually debriefing is done privately between or among each team of parties and is not often a joint effort. And of course, there's always a situation of impasse. If some or all of the disputes were not settled, the parties need to, before they leave the room, make a plan for the next step. Often that can be determined by the contract terms, and the parties may want to establish a timeline there for when they're going to take the next step, clarify who is required to take the first step. There may be such a provision in the contract terms. And independently, once they leave the negotiating room, parties are going to conduct a cost and resource analysis. That might be an opportunity to come back and review those contract terms. And as we get into discussing some of the hybrid procedures and down the line look at dispute resolution as a risk management tool, there are some newer procedures coming out to help the parties when they're in this situation of trying negotiation or even sometimes trying mediation, reaching an impasse. And the next step in the contract may well be arbitration or litigation. There's some other ways to use negotiation and assisted negotiation to reevaluate those terms, taking into account any progress that might have been made in the negotiation. And again, always have a timeline. It's good to make the timeline with the other side, but also make one independently and try to keep the lines of communication open. All of these steps, even if they can't help immediately resolve this dispute, will make the next step, whether it's mediation or litigation or something in between, a little bit easier. And that concludes the negotiation lectures for this series.